What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Bob Kerrey, the former governor of Nebraska, a U.S. senator, and a member of the 9/11 Commission. Senator Kerrey was first on the podcast in 2018, and in that conversation, we discussed the then recently redacted 28 pages from the Congressional Joint Inquiry Report into the intelligence community's activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. In those pages, we learned that members of the Saudi government and royal family had provided financial, logistical, and other forms of support to some of the 9/11 hijackers and their associates in the months and years leading up to those attacks. In the years since those pages were released to the public, additional information has come out, mainly through lawsuits filed by 9/11 family members that provide not only further information about Saudi government involvement, but also troubling details about the CIA's own actions in the lead-up to 9/11 and a potential cover-up of those activities by the agency and members of the Bush White House in the months and years afterward. I asked Senator Kerrey back on the podcast today as we near the 23-year anniversary of those attacks to discuss how these latest findings change our understanding of one of the most seminal events in American history, what they suggest about how our government works and where power resides in Washington, and what we as citizens of this country can do to restore accountability in the democratic halls of power. If you enjoy this podcast and it brings valuable insights into your life and business, consider joining our premium feed, where you'll gain access to subscriber-only podcasts, early releases, extended episode content, transcripts, and intelligence reports at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this profoundly important and deeply illuminating conversation with my guest, Senator Bob Kerrey. Senator Bob Kerrey, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
Nice to be with you.
So I just have a technical question, which is, so you were the governor of Nebraska, and then you became a U.S. senator twice. You were a two-term senator.
Yes.
How does someone refer to someone that was a governor and a senator? Is there one title that takes precedence over the other?
Not really. I mean, if there's opinions on it, I prefer Bob, unless you're a maitre d' in a restaurant I'm trying to get into here in New York City. But it's in Nebraska, they typically say governor.
Did you ever see the Beverly Hills Cop movies?
Yeah.
Remember that in Beverly Hills Cop 2, they introduced Taggart as President Ford? No one actually knew if he was President Ford or not. But anyway, so it's great having you back on. What prompted me to reach out to you to have you back on the show was a video that had come out that was unsealed from a plaintiff's case of 9/11 families against the Saudi government. I think the case is in the Southern District of New York. The video was of an alleged Saudi intelligence officer by the name of Omar al-Bayoumi. This was not the only piece of information that's come out in the years since you and I talked. We had done an interview back in 2018, and in part of that conversation, we talked about your time on the 9/11 Commission. You were one of the 10 members of the 9/11 Commission. And so this was a couple of years after the 28 pages had been, the redacted 28 pages from the Joint Congressional Inquiry had been released, which showed, again, a level of Saudi involvement that we hadn't really been told, the public hadn't been made aware of after 9/11. And of course, this was after 9/11 was where the attacks were largely blamed on Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, but there were intimations that there was state support. Yes, the Taliban fell in that category, but there were hints and suggestions that somehow it was Saddam. And of course, that's where the Bush administration decided to wage war against Iraq, and the rest is history, as they say. So I wanted to bring you back on to talk about what we've learned since and to have more of that conversation on the anniversary of 9/11. We're going to be releasing this around the date of 9/11. Before we get into that, though, I would love to just kind of catch up with you on kind of what you've been up to and also talk a little bit of politics because we are now headed into the 2024 election. So first of all, how you been? What's new with you since we last recorded an episode together?
Well, the most important thing is that I've had two surgeries on the leg that was damaged in the Vietnam War. It's called osseointegration. So I have not walked since the 19th of March. I went down to Walter Reed. They did surgery on 20 March. I did a second one on 22 May. And as I said, I'm going down to Walter Reed Sunday to begin the walking phase. They'll fit me for a different kind of prosthetic than before. So I'm learning to walk all over again. So, and learning how to adjust being in a wheelchair.
So I definitely recommend that people go back and listen to our episode in 2018. That was episode 72, I think. And you actually shared your story. I had read your book ahead of that conversation. And we talked about your experience serving in Vietnam. You were a Navy SEAL serving Vietnam. We talked about your experience. We actually talked about everything from when you were a kid growing up in Nebraska, how you lost your leg. You got a Medal of Honor from President Nixon. We talked about that whole experience. And I remember you saying that it was actually very painful, that the only thing you could really remember from your time getting that Medal of Honor was that you were in pain, just standing up, walking around.
Oh, yeah.
Is that something that you're dealing with again now?
Well, I'm not dealing with it now because I'm in a wheelchair. I'm sitting, so there's no weight on that limb. But then at that time, I was wearing a wooden leg. I just recently out of the hospital. I don't know how many Tylenol I took before going into the White House, quite a few. And you're always dealing with some level of pain. So you're never completely pain-free. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little, and you just learn to adjust. You learn to deal with it.
So we live near, we moved out of the city during COVID, but we were like basically neighbors. In fact, I don't know if you remember, we used to see each other sometimes around the block.
And I'm getting all your baby stuff.
Yeah, well, there's a whole backstory to that. But yeah, we have a baby in the house, and you mistakenly received some of those items at your apartment instead of ours, even though we're not living there anymore. Yeah. But that was sort of what I wanted to ask you, because besides being a senator and a governor, you were also president of the New School, and you've been living in the city for many years now. And I'm curious, how has the city changed since COVID, do you think?
Well, first of all, as you know, to get around the city, you either take a bus, take the subway, take a taxi, you get a car. For the most part, you walk. So in New York City, the sidewalks are full of people. And sometimes there's a lot of people on the sidewalk. So you get a lot of walking in. And it's people are a little tenser than they would be if they're in their car. But it's, people are pretty much people no matter where you go. They're taking care of their family. They're doing all the usual things. And I was the Grand Marshal for the Veterans Day Parade a couple of years ago. And, it was just wall to wall from about 23rd Street all the way up to the 50s on Fifth Avenue with people waving the American flag, lots of immigrants, lots of people that love the country. They love, celebrating what the country allows them to do. So it's an unusual place. You presume, it's full of radical liberals. It's not. It's, I'm sure my vote's worthless as I'm a Democrat voting in New York, but people are trying to solve problems. And for the most part, it's amazing how the city manages to operate.
So how has America changed in the last 4 years, in your opinion? And feel free to go even further back. I mean, you and I spoke in 2018. I don't really remember what we talked about, even if we talked about politics much. Those first 4 years of the podcast, I really tried to avoid it because it was just so vitriolic. Not that it's substantially better now, though I do think it's a little bit better. But, what is your impression of the country today?
Well, we've got a lot of challenges. I still feel lucky to have been born here. So, and in my case, I'm 80 years old. We've had a good run. I have in my lifetime. So, and now we've got bigger challenges. We've got lots of problems with the federal budget. We've got the global situation is more difficult than it was before, even though it made it slightly less dangerous than it was before. But, we've got a very, very belligerent China that's pushing its weight around in Asia. We've got Iran is still very, very unpredictable, to say the least, and killing going on in the Middle East. But it's not like we're sitting around worried at the moment, anyway, of a major. I don't worry about a major conflagration in the world. I think we're in better shape than we were before, but it's harder. I mean, for 75 years, free trade worked. For 75 years, we were, the middle class was growing, almost without making much of an effort. Manufacturing was solid, everything looked good, and now it's not quite so good. I think our problems are solvable. But it's gotten difficult. One way for me to look at it is when I got to the Senate in 1989, first of all, every single minute of my public service, and when I was in politics, was before Google, before Facebook, before the iPhone, before Twitter, for all these social media sites that unquestionably give you better access, but it's a lot easier to pump a conspiracy theory out there than it was before. People organize differently than before, and it can get ugly. You couldn't dock somebody during the 1980s and 90s. In addition, in my view, the quality, particularly on the Republican side, has changed a lot. I mean, Al Simpson became a very good friend, senator from Wyoming. Al would lose a primary in Wyoming today. Bob Dole would lose a primary in Kansas. Rudman would lose a primary in New Hampshire. I think Hatfield would probably lose out in Oregon. I think Danforth would in Missouri. I think all these are Republicans. They tend to be more moderate. They're fiscally conservative. They care about the world. A lot of them came out of the Second World War, that's gone, and it matters. So I think that it's gotten more difficult. The Democrats themselves have gotten a little more extreme, a little more difficult but the Republican Party is the one that's changed the most, especially under Trump, because it's almost like there's no ideology. There's no barriers to insulting people. There's no barriers to lying. In fact, the biggest barrier that used to be there, if you lose an election, and I've lost a couple, you call your opponent and you concede. And it's a hard call. You think, oh my God, do I got to call that jerk? I've been campaigning against him. I got to call and say, you won, I lost. It's a very difficult thing to do. And I hope that Trump's unwillingness to do that in 20 is an outlier. I couldn't vote for him just on that basis alone. I hope we can get back to a more normalized Republican Party where they care about fiscal responsibility. They got all kinds of issues they care about, but not having to defend a man who said he won the election in 20. He didn't. He lost. And that's unquestionably made it a lot more toxic and difficult than it was before.
So the audience here knows, I haven't spared any criticism for Donald Trump for many reasons. That's just one of them. But I take a step back, and this kind of, I think, will lead us into a conversation eventually about 9/11, which is, like I said, the reason that I initially reached out. I feel like Donald Trump is a symptom of a larger problem, and I feel like what he did, he basically lit the Republican Party on fire in 2016. That moment on the stage with Jeb Bush, I think, was really symbolic of many of the issues that had built up in the Republican Party, and a lot of people blamed the Republican legacy around the war and the turn of the party in 2008 and all that stuff on the Bushes and the neoconservatives and the globalists, et cetera.
The Tea Party in 2010, that was a pivotal moment.
Right. Totally. It doesn't seem like the Democrats have had that moment, and it seems that they should have that moment. The Democratic Party feels like it's really jumped the shark, not just on cultural issues, but also, look, I know it's like a really easy giveaway line, but boy, do they seem like a corrupt, very sort of unaccountable party. Lack of accountability is a problem in general in politics today. But what'd you say to people that are like, they'll watch the DNC and they'll hear about how Kamala is going to tax the billionaires at the same time as she's trotting out surrogates like billionaire governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, or about how democracy's on the line at the same time as they're weaponizing the justice system to go after their political enemies. What do you say to people who look at that and feel like the inclusive liberal rhetoric fails to match up with the policies and the actions of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, it's not a bad question. I do sometimes feel like I'm still registered as a Democrat, but there are times I wonder, is this a party I joined and when I first ran for office all the way back in 1982. So, and in addition, money has really corrupted politics. It really has. The Citizens United decision just made it extremely difficult because there'll be more, if you're running if you go out to Nebraska and you run in the Senate out there, which I did in 2012, if you got to Nebraska, we raised, $4 or $5 million. The external money was greater than that. So people that don't live in Nebraska, that don't understand Nebraska, they tend to dominate the agenda. And it can get very disheartening if you're a Democrat. And my hope is this convention has begun to push us back to say, what does the middle class need? What do working people need? They were waving the American flag. They were not waving a multicolored flag. It was the American flag, and they were chanting USA, USA. I like that they're coming back to patriotism because that's how most people think, when they're trying to think about what to do with the country. The thing that bothers me more is I heard people say, I'm not sure democracy works. And first of all, we don't have a democracy. We never had we've always been a Republican form. But the big idea that we used to write our Constitution, break away from England in 1776 through 1783, was a liberal idea. Not liberal in the way we typically think, but that individuals should have freedom. The government shouldn't tell us what to do. We don't want a king. We don't want a religion. We want to be able to decide on our own. Well, that's a brilliant and it's a phenomenal idea. And we tried to write a constitution around it. We allowed slavery for another 150 years or so. So it was far from perfect. Women couldn't vote till the 19th Amendment. So we're making this union more perfect. But if we lose confidence that this liberal idea works, that we can create a government of by and for the people that allows us to do what we want to do, that allows us to say what we want to do. And this whole woke movement that unfortunately was embraced by many people in the Democratic Party is maddening because it takes you to a point where I can't say anything. My kids went to school here in New York City. I've got a 22-year-old. God, if I get your gender wrong, or if I say something offensive, you go batshit crazy and we can't have a conversation. So I think there's a lot of challenges inside a democracy that weren't there before, but we should not lose confidence that this liberal idea, and that's what it is. I'm over the lifetime, it feels like I've become more liberal and less progressive. Liberal in that I want to make certain that we preserve that freedom, that we, as an individual, have the capacity to do and say what we want. You ask about New York. One of the best things about New York is the immigrant population. You don't have to tell an immigrant that this is a great country. You don't have to tell an immigrant that the idea of being able to say and do what you want to do and travel wherever you want is a genius idea. In many ways, the immigrant population is more patriotic than the indigenous population. So I hope we don't lose that. I hope we don't become so cynical. And cynicism is a disease, oftentimes passed on by older people who've just given up. And I'm encouraged both on the Republican and the Democratic side by the number of young people that are stepping up and say, I want to serve. I want to be a part of this. Because that's what's going to sustain us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on the cynicism. That doesn't lead anywhere, even if it might seem like the sort of common sense response to some of this stuff.
Look, I think skepticism is necessary. So if you tell me the earth is flat, I'm going to challenge you. And we'll have an argument. Whatever you assert, you've got the right to say it, but I've got the right as a skeptic to say, prove it. Show me the facts. Prove it up. But if I become a cynic, I stop believing that human beings have the capacity to do good. A liberal democracy will not survive that. If that becomes more and more widespread, it won't survive it. And there's no question that sometimes political behavior, the behavior of the people that are in Congress, they can run cross purposes with that objective.
Yeah, so no, I agree with you. I mean, the Democrats, I think what you're saying is that they've become more illiberal, right?
More illiberal. They were opponents of liberalism when the Constitution was written. So that's an old process. There's an argument against liberalism, and unfortunately, it's been broadened.
But I'm saying the Democrats have become less liberal.
I don't think they have, but they certainly have many of them that talk. If you go,
what is this speech policing stuff, or a lot of the policies during COVID? I mean, those aren't liberal policies.
I don't disagree with that. But if you go and talk to a Democratic governor, then one of the best things about this new nominating process, the selection of the vice president, was we were introduced to a half a dozen governors who are managing their state. If you listen to Jared Polis in Colorado, if you identify what he's voting, you think, well, God, this guy's a real screaming liberal. He's proposing tax cuts. All these Democratic governors tend to answer the question, not only how much money we spend, but how do we create a tax environment to encourage the creation of jobs? And I think the national Democrats have gotten the word that they better start doing the same. But look, it's not an easy thing to do, to try to identify a problem inside of any political party, especially when I've been out of it so damn long. I'm not sure you want to trust my opinion. But I care deeply about our democracy. I think the liberal idea that the founders had was a genius idea. I think it may be the most powerful idea that human beings have ever had. And it's always at risk. All we have to do is surrender, and we're done.
Yeah, what are the challenges with having conversations like these also is that it's not necessarily easy, especially for people like me and other sort of laymen, people that don't have a deep experience in government, to separate out cultural trends from government policies. So a lot of this stuff also, it's really unclear how it got into the party, how much of it stemmed from the culture, which culture in particular. I mean, a good example is the speech policing, because you were president of the New School for how many years?
End of the day.
Okay, so like I said, we were basically neighbors, and I went to NYU, and before we moved out of the city, I would walk around that area. That's where I lived. And I remember in something like 2018, this is around the time that I had Jonathan Haidt on the show, who had written the book about speech policing, The Coddling of the American Mind. Yes. And I remember being in an elevator at NYU and seeing a poster about reporting people if they said something that was I don't remember what the terminology was that was being used in this letter, but it was basically like if someone says something that you don't like, report on them. And this is, by the way, at the same time that I remember checking that the tuition was $70,000 a year, which I think, that also kind of speaks to part of the problem that's happening at universities is that these students are becoming customers. So again, like I don't want to do that thing where I throw everything on the party, but the Democratic Party does seem to embrace a lot of this stuff. I mean, if you had to describe what the Democratic Party platform is today, like what they stand for, what do you think that would be?
I think it's come back around to supporting the middle class and the working class. At least that's what the DNC was, and it's what Democratic governors talk about all the time. By the way, it's what Republican governors talk about all the time. If you want to have your confidence restored in democracy, you got to go back down to the state level because Congress is difficult. At 535 people in an environment where it matters more how many people are following you on your Twitter account or your X account or whatever you call it, using it as a noun, it gets more difficult because you can take an issue like gun control, for example. Friedman says 40% of American people are for gun control. Only 40% are against it. Only 40%? Can you find me somebody that won an election by 40 points? Elections turn typically on 5, 6, 7, 8 points. So you can organize both for and against a vote and make it sound like, Senator Blowhard is the worst person in the world. I mean, it's what the iPhone and social media has allowed. It's allowed the public, the citizens, to organize and make it difficult for people to do the right thing. I'll give you an example. The biggest fiscal problem we have in America right now is the unsustainability of Social Security and Medicare. Are either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris talking about it? Are they identified it as a problem? We have 3 workers today for every beneficiary. It's going to go to 2 in 7 years. It's a problem that's difficult to face in part because if I get 10% of the voters that say Bob Kerrey is going to cut Social Security and seniors are going to be foraging in the alley for food, I probably lose my election. So it's gotten harder to do things that aren't necessarily popular. The best things America's ever done in the entire 250 plus years we've been around are things that were unpopular, not things that were popular. So it's gotten more difficult, I think. And I hear all the time people come up and say, it's terrible, I'm not going to vote, I'm going to give up. And say, well, whose Navy's going to defend you? You say to me on Veterans Day, thank you for your service. And, you got to play a part in this thing. I'm not asking you to go out and risk your life to participate in politics. I'm asking you to get over your disappointments, to persevere. Don't stop. Don't quit. You quit, it's all over. And it's easy to find reason to give up today, but it's a bad thing. It's a dangerous thing.
So I guess I have 2 questions that stem from this. One is, how do problems like this typically resolve themselves? Let me ask that first. So like you talked about if something's unpopular, but the best things are usually that we've done are usually the things that are unpopular or difficult to do. What sort of environment or what set of variables need to be in place in order for problems like this to resolve themselves? Example being the unsustainability of our pension system, our Social Security system, or Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, what needs to happen for something like that to get resolved?
Oh, you've got to have leadership, and it takes courage.
Who do you think is a good leader in this country?
Take another big contentious problem, immigration. Oklahoma Senator Jim Lankford took the lead on that. He's a conservative Republican. He organized a group of Republican Democrats and got killed by Donald Trump. He thought it would help at the time. He thought it would help Biden. And those sorts of things happen. But the bipartisan support for a piece of legislation is still there. Whether it's Trump or Harris, I prefer Harris. Whether it's Trump or Harris, it's still there. Those guys took a risk. They work with somebody from the opposite party, and that puts them at risk in a primary. I mean, I think Lankford probably wins a primary, Republican primary in Oklahoma, but my guess is there's a lot of MAGA Republicans in Oklahoma are mad as hell at it for working with Democrats to try to solve what is unquestionably a very, very contentious and difficult problem.
Why doesn't that get resolved? Is it because of how extreme both parties have become that we can't solve immigration, just like everything else?
It isn't so much that they've become extreme. It's just that there's a penalty for solving a problem at the margin. Penalty for a Democrat who works with a Republican. Take almost any issue. Take Social Security and Medicare, which is a good one. Social Security is easier. Take Social Security. If I was in the Senate, I would find a Republican, as I did when I was in the Senate. I worked with basically with Alan Simpson. And it was Pat Moynihan and I and Alan Simpson. But we didn't have to worry about somebody walking up with a cell phone, sticking it in your face and get a little recording of you and then posting it on the internet. We didn't have people who didn't give a damn about representing and working in democracy. They just want to be influencers. You saw that at the Democratic Convention. We had speakers who hold no elected office, no leadership position, other than they got a couple million people following them on Twitter or Instagram or something like that. So we got a different environment than we've had before. And I think it's more difficult as a consequence. Understand, Demetri, almost everything I've been saying to you is to discourage the listeners from giving up. Don't give up. Be a skeptic, get angry, but whatever you want, but don't give up.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So I think it unquestionably is harder as a consequence of social media, particularly in the House. There's a tendency, if you're a Democrat, you got to beat back a Democrat. You saw it here in New York. AOC won against a moderate Democrat. And she said, well, he'd fallen out of touch. I'm not criticizing her, but he was a good member of the House.
He probably just wasn't very good on social media. I mean, I didn't follow it, but...
Not just social media. It's that he offended the truly committed, tend to be more liberal Democrat who want more. They want the Green New Deal. They want to tax the rich or whatever. They've got position. They want to pick up all the guns, pick an issue. And he puts a moderate position out there, and we don't want any moderation. The same thing happens on the Republican side. So you see in the House, you see a greater distance between the Republicans and the Democrats. And you see it on the committees. And you see it less so on appropriation. And I think you see it still less so on the Senate. But the Senate's becoming more and more like the House.
Well, what explains that, though? Like I've heard about redistricting as one example, self-sorting by the public.
Yeah, I think redistricting is a big problem. But the bigger problem is if I'm running for election, think primary now. And the primaries are relatively recent, 50 years or something like that. It's not like the primaries were there when the Republicans founded. That's a new phenomenon. But it's enormously important if you're running for office. If you can't win the primary, you can't win the general. And the primaries tend to be much more conservative if you're running as a Republican and much more liberal if you're running as a Democrat. And what typically happens where Republicans get mad is when somebody works with the Democrat on some issue and vice versa, likewise with the Democrat. So it's harder to sustain that middle ground. It just is. And there's lots of other things that are part of it as well. I mean, if you want to get deep in, I think at the presidential level, we have delegated way too much power to the two parties. These are non-for-profits. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are well-established political organizations. They're not-for-profit organizations. They have special tax status, and they decide what's the nominating process? When are the primaries going to be held? How much money can you spend? And I personally think we need a federal law that takes power away from those two parties and makes it likely if somebody wants to run as an independent candidate, they can. The parties have way too much power.
So again, this is interesting because there are a lot of examples like this. Another one is, you mentioned it, I think, in the beginning, which is the amount of money that you now need to get elected. I remember watching the 60 Minutes episode or documentary where they actually showed viewers a room where congressmen and women have to go to be on the phone for like 6 or 8 hours a day, some crazy number of hours, just to raise money.
There are very few people that can do it for 6 or 8 hours, but you're right. They call it dialing for dollars. And that's another thing, a relatively recent change in the 1970s. They created, the Congress, that was before I got there, the Democrats created and the Republicans created 2 committees in the House and 2 committees in the Senate. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the Republican Senatorial, and the comparable in the House, the Democratic Congressional Committee, and the Republican, and they created these organizations. And they decide how the money's going to get allocated in large measure. You got to go to the leadership to get your money. And what it does, take Alan Simpson again. If Alan Simpson and I were in the Senate today, and I chaired the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee for 4 years, I'd abolish all 4 of those committees. Because I think it's more than just you're having to raise money for several hours a day. It makes it difficult to create partnerships with somebody in the opposite party. You're out there working with Alan Simpson on Social Security while the DSCC is running ads telling people how horrible it is because he's going to take your Social Security away from you. It's difficult to sustain an effort if you got those committees, in my opinion. And the power has moved over to the leadership as a result. I'm getting way down in the weeds here and getting boring, but
No, not boring at all, actually. This is very interesting. So the incentives don't seem to be aligned to reform from the inside, though, because once you're in...
Oh, I don't know. I mean, one of my favorite senators when I was down there was a guy named Fritz Hollings from South Carolina. Fritz was in all of the campaigns in World War II, from Africa all the way through Europe. Phenomenal human being. And Fritz would talk about the good old days when you'd be able to walk out into the lobby and people would hand you a bag of cash. So it's less corrupt than it used to be.
Is that right? It's less corrupt? Because the feeling from people is that it's never been this corrupt.
Nothing Bob Menendez would have caused him to leave his office if he did that 40 years ago. I don't think. Or 50 years ago. And it's difficult to acknowledge the progress that we're making. I do think Citizens United has been awful because it tends to massively corrupt. So that if you tell me you want to run for office, the first question I'm going to ask you is, how much money can you raise? Because if you can't raise the money or self-fund, it's difficult to be a candidate. It really is. Now, the small donations that are coming in on the internet have helped a bit, but Citizens United has really made it difficult to make certain that the agenda aligns with the voter themselves. It tends to align with whatever the interest group wants the politician to support.
Fascinating. So let's now transition to a conversation about 9/11, and there will be opportunities during this conversation to reflect on the state of politics today, because I think this is obviously, I don't think it is. This was one of the most seminal events in American history, one of the most devastating attacks on U.S. soil in American history, and obviously led to a series of both domestic and foreign policy choices around surveillance, extraordinary renditions, though that practice had started under the Clinton administration, the extensive use of executive orders, the curbing of privacy rights, mass surveillance, and of course, the war in Iraq and all the rest of it. As I mentioned, there was a character named Omar al-Bayoumi, who was one of a number of Saudi officials, people either directly employed for Saudi intelligence or the Ministry of Islamic Affairs or somehow affiliated with them. Bayoumi, actually, interestingly enough, and another character by the name of Osama Basnan were both on the payroll of Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar. I mean, he and his wife, Haifa bin Faisal, were literally cutting checks from their bank account at Riggs Bank. He was, as I said, he was featured in a video recently that was unsealed as a result of 9/11 family's court case in the Southern District of New York. This video was originally obtained in a raid on his London apartment days after 9/11 by the Metropolitan Police. And what was also found in the apartment was not just this tape, but also a tape of him at a party at the apartment of two of the hijackers.
Yeah, he helped them find residences in San Diego. We knew that.
Exactly. He actually co-signed their apartment lease and provided funds to help them open a bank account. These two hijackers were Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mindar. Al-Mindar, and not to get too much in the weeds here, was also the son-in-law of Ahmed al-Hada, who operated an Al-Qaeda safe house and communication hub in Sana'a, Yemen, that was a critical monitoring point for both the CIA and NSA ahead of 9/11. This guy, Mindar and Hazmi, they were both picked up from Kuala Lumpur at the Malaysia summit meeting that happened where the USS Cole bombing was also planned. So anyway, we could go into all of that, and hopefully we will. But this video surfaced. It was just, again, there's been a kind of a drip of information that's come out over the years. As I said, this video was found alongside another video that featured him and two of the hijackers at their apartment in San Diego. It was a kind of a party for them. Bayoumi, it has come out since, and actually most of this information was known pretty much right away. In fact, it was known to the Joint Inquiry Commission, which redacted the 28 pages. But he, as we said, he helped the hijackers get acclimated. Alongside these two videos, there was also a sketch of a plane and distances from the ground. The video that I'm referencing also that came out was him at the National Mall, at the Capitol, casing the Capitol. It was almost like a reconnaissance video. But each time this stuff comes out, we never get a broader context of like, what does this have to do with anything, right? Like, I think for most people, 9/11 was really about, as I said, I think I mentioned this in the beginning, was this international terrorist organization. To the extent that there were state sponsors, it was Afghanistan. And to the extent that there was any CIA, FBI, NSA, blah, blah, blah involvement, it was basically these agencies messed up. They were not collaborating with each other. What's actually come out over the years is that not only were they not cooperating, but in certain instances, the CIA was purposefully undermining the FBI by preventing information.
I have to interrupt you. That's because the CIA and the FBI have two different missions. The CIA is collecting intelligence. The FBI is prosecuting people. And it's not uncommon for those to come into conflict, pretty regularly to come into conflict. Because if I arrest you and start to prosecute you, you're no longer a source. I can no longer use you to collect intelligence.
Totally right. Actually, I've heard the same thing. But what's interesting, and I don't know if you're familiar with this now, Richard Clarke gave an interview. Richard Clarke, was he officially what was his title at the White? Because he worked for the White House at the time. He was kind of the liaison between the CIA and the NSC and the White House and the president, something like that? I mean,
I don't know what his title was, but he was a real serious expert on counterterrorism.
absolutely. And you guys interviewed him at the 9/11 Commission, and he gave that famous...
He turned around and said, apologized to the family.
He was very helpful, I remember. And I don't know, did you ever see that interview that he gave in 2009? This was now before the redacted pages came out, which he then gave an interview to ABC about it. But in 2009, he gave an interview where he gave his theory as to what happened on 9/11. Did you ever hear that interview?
What did he say?
So there are basically two components to this story, as you know. One is the Saudi connection. You know, what role did the Saudis play? Who in the Saudi government played a role? You had said on my show that the Saudis had blood on their hands. I want to understand what you think that role was. But one was the Saudi role. And then the other one was the CIA and what explains the fact that we now know that the CIA knew, and Richard Clark believes it's implausible to think that George Tenet himself didn't know, that these two guys specifically, and there were others. I mean, there was a terrorist network of people in the United States. I mean, San Diego was one, Southern California was one place they were, Los Angeles, San Diego, but you had counties all over Florida, you had Boston, you had up in Maine people, you had Washington, D.C., suburban Washington. So there were a lot of people in a lot of places, but just to take these two folks, Clark says it's implausible that Tenet didn't know. We now know that the number he put there, and I've seen this corroborated in other sources, that there were approximately 50 people at CIA that had this information that knew that al-Mindar and Hazmi were in San Diego, that they had gotten multiple entry visas to leave Kuala Lumpur, where they went to Bangkok, Thailand, and then they came to Los Angeles, where they were greeted by Bayoumi, who then got them settled in San Diego, that this information was known to the CIA. And then at some point in the summer of 2001, this is the period now where George Tenet was running around saying his hair was on fire, where they had principals meetings on July 10th with Condi Rice and other people at the NSC at the White House. Then there was another meeting again on August 6th, and then, of course, they had a September 4th meeting. Richard Clark and Tenet were talking throughout this period of time, and it never at any time during this period, when, again, like George Tenet said that he had called the most urgent meeting of his life on August 6th, did they bring up these two hijackers. And Clark's thesis is like, it's just inconceivable to him, one, that Tenet didn't know because of just how hands-on Tenet was around everything, getting raw intelligence and going through it and obsessive about al-Qaeda. It was implausible he didn't know, and it didn't make any sense why he wouldn't tell him or tell the president or tell Condoleezza Rice when he's putting out PDBs saying, bin Laden determined to attack the United States. They're trying to convince the White House to take this threat seriously, but they're not telling them, hey, we got two guys that were in the same meeting where they figured out the strategy to bomb the USS Cole, and they're living in San Diego. And so his thesis is that what probably was going on was that the CIA, at some point after Cofer Black came in, who headed up counterterrorism at CIA. So when Cofer Black came in, Richard Clark tells a story about how he and Cofer had a conversation, and Cofer was incensed that the CIA didn't have sources inside of al-Qaeda. He was determined to get sources inside. They were trying to flip this one guy ahead of the Kuala Lumpur meeting. That failed. And in the process of trying to flip that guy, we know that they learned about these other two guys that ended up becoming two of the 9/11 hijackers, and that they decided they were going to flip them. And what happened was they interceded a cable that came to CIA that would have been distributed out and that the FBI would have had access to. And this is again, Clark's thesis, that they purposefully prevented that cable from going out. And there's actually, I can't remember now the name offhand because I did quite a bit of work going through all the documents to figure this out. But there's a specific person who was, I think, from the FBI field office at Alex Station at CIA, which was the Bin Laden unit, run at the time by Rich Blee, but it was created by Michael Scheuer. And they were prevented from sending that out. And so Clark's thesis is they purposefully withheld this information from FBI because they wanted to try and flip these guys. And that maybe al-Bayoumi and some of these other folks that were involved were working through the Saudi intelligence, through the General Intelligence Presidency, I think it's called, and that maybe some of those guys were double agents and they worked against the CIA. And at some point in the summer of 2001, the CIA kind of figured this out. They were getting played or something was going on, something was wrong, or they had lost track of these guys or something. And rather than fess up to the White House about what had happened, they withheld the information. And Clark says, had they just told us about these hijackers, these two people, had they just said this, even in the September 4th meeting, we could have arrested those guys. We could have arrested them within 24 hours because they were using their credit cards in their own name. They were booking hotels in their own name. And so that's sort of his thesis of what happened. And I'm curious how that jives with your interpretation, given everything you know and what you learned during the course of this investigation.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a harder question because, we had a timeline. We had 24 July and we were out of money. Our authorization to issue subpoenas ended, and Congress was in no mood to either extend the timeline or allocate more resources. So there's lots that we were unable to investigate just because the clock ran out. That leads to the second thing I say is Congress has lots of power, lots of authority to take this on. So oftentimes people say, why doesn't the 9/11 Commission, we put a not-for-profit together that had no teeth. We tried to gum them back into business. We couldn't. We didn't have the power. There's 535 members of Congress. I think there's enough coming out already on Bayumi. They should investigate it. They don't need to investigate whether or not Joe and Hunter Biden did something bad. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think you really have to understand the context of the 1990s. Remember, there was a Muslim terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. And we made fun of them. Nose, hair, and salami, we called them. Because they went back and tried to get a refund on the Ryder truck that they'd used to blow up the building. They damn near brought that building down then. We didn't elevate it. Even after the August 7th attack on our East African embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, 280 people killed in a simultaneous, very sophisticated attack. That was an impressive military attack. What did? We threw a couple of Tomahawk missiles into Al-Qaeda's camps in Afghanistan. But that was it, because we didn't elevate the threat. And likewise with the coal. The coal was more maddening for me because I'm U.S. Navy. But we didn't elevate the threat. We didn't think that they could do what they did. And they demonstrated they had far more capacity, and we should have known it. And maybe the most important lesson for me coming out of this is that I think there's been a bipartisan change in this regard. If you want to disagree with American policy, you're a Palestinian or whatever, and you want to disagree with American policy, vote for somebody else and call us all kinds of names, fine. But the day you say you're going to declare war on us, which is what Al-Qaeda did, and the day you say our disagreement is going to lead to me trying to kill Americans, we're going to put a bullseye on your back. And we're not going to advertise it. We're not going to do a press conference about it. Just know that if you try to kill Americans, your life is at risk. And we didn't do that before. We tolerated, I think we tolerated personnel coming out of Saudi Arabia as a consequence of their need to support the Wahhabis to stay in power, saying and doing all kinds of bad things towards the United States. So I don't know how we could have changed that, because it changed instantaneously. After 9/11, people said, oh my God, how could they do that? And they did it with a relatively small amount of money. It's not like they were sophisticated military personnel. You went into the cafe where Mohammed Atta in Hamburg, Germany was, lining up people to learn how to fly planes in the United States. You'd look at him and you would say, well, he's not dangerous. He looks like an ordinary guy over there with his laptop. He was checking for the best price for flight schools in the United States. So I think the underestimation of the threat was the biggest problem. And it may be the overestimation of the threat that created more problems than we needed after 9/11.
So again, like you are in a position to know much more than me. So I want to give you my impression here. My impression is that the CIA did not underestimate the threat. I mean, they certainly had a dedicated unit to it. And it seems that George Tenet was pretty obsessed about Al-Qaeda, at least based on what I have read and what people like Richard Clarke have said. It seems that the Bush White House didn't take the threat seriously.
You can't target the Bush White House or the Clinton White House. It's the entire political class. And I was a part of that class. So what Tenet's got customers. He's got national security customer and he delivers intel to them. But if he can't persuade you, at the time it was Bush, it was Clinton before that. If he can't persuade the elected national leaders that have both the authority and the capacity.
But this goes back to my point. So this is actually great. This goes back to my point about Clark's comments around Tenet withholding information. Again, allegedly withholding information, key information about the presence of al-Mindar and Hazmi in San Diego. If he wanted to make the case, he could have made that case much more strongly, but he didn't. And furthermore, what comes to light in the course of looking through everything we know today is it seems that the CIA not only had the tools to stop the attacks, they could have stopped the attacks. They didn't. I'm not saying they purposely let the attacks happen. I'm saying it seems like sort of, again, the thesis is they were more concerned with covering their asses than they were in doing everything possible to prevent the attacks. Then the attacks happened. And what ended up happening was you saw guys like George Tenet coming before the 9/11 Commission. And by the way, I watched a bunch of those testimonies again. Those guys, and I remember this too. I remember after 9/11, I remember that administration being super combative. And by the way, watching those testimonies, you have to tell me if this is just my impression, it seemed like everybody, like Condi Rice, George Tenet, I'm trying to think who else I saw, not Richard Clarke, they were pretty sort of bold-faced to you guys. They seem to come with a certain level of righteousness. And this was also during the Iraq War. I think the invasion already happened. But guys like Tenet were basically saying, like, the reason these attacks happened, and this was the argument they said, was we need the gloves off. But in fact, what you see when you look back is that that's not why the attacks happened. They didn't lack the tools to stop them. But then after the attacks happened, no one was held accountable. And on top of that, they said that they need more power. And what we got was this massive surveillance state that's grown since 9/11. Do you agree with that? Do you not agree with that? Where would you push back against that?
I agree with it, but you have to put it back in the context. They weren't alone. I actually can't think of a member of Congress in the 1990s who was saying, they attacked us in 1993. They attacked our East African embassy. They attacked the coal. We got to ratchet that threat up to number one. It wasn't number one on the morning of 9/11. I don't know where it was on national security threats. It wasn't considered to be a major national security threat in spite of the evidence. And I take the East African embassy bombing because that was a sophisticated operation, hitting two embassies like within about 15 minutes of each other. So we had plenty of evidence that it was a threat. What we didn't do was we didn't say it's a serious threat. We didn't say we better run this thing to the ground because these guys have the capacity to kill a lot of Americans inside the United States of America. And they'd already been killing them outside. I don't know what we needed besides the coal to say we got to turn this thing upside down. We've got threats from Al-Qaeda lower than we're dealing with drug cartels. We're more worried about things that were less of concern not after the fact. After the fact, oh my God, that should have been public threat number one, and it wasn't. It didn't become public threat number one until after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, again, though, I don't think that negates my argument, which is that irrespective of whether it was number one or not, it seems that they were in a position to stop it and that they weren't lacking the tools to be able to do it. Did you guys get to interview Prince Bandar, the U.S. ambassador?
No.
How difficult was it to get interviews and to get these people to answer questions, the people that you wanted to speak to?
This is why Congress needs to do this. We were not members of Congress. We did not have that kind of support. And it's exceptionally difficult to get either classified information from witnesses or classified documents from the agencies, the 15 agencies that control all the documents. You got to go out there. NSA was a favorite target. You got to go to the NSA in Maryland. They take you into a special room. You tell them what you want. If you don't identify precisely what you want, they're not going to deliver it to you. And they sit there and watch you take notes. You can't take your notes out. You got to leave your notes there. The regulatory friction on the maintaining of secrets is intense. And it was exceptionally, I don't know how the other people on the commission felt, but it was hard. It was really hard to get access to it. And again, if you're not a member of Congress, you know that on 24 July, you're out of business. So I think my case from that is not that we need the 9/11 Commission, another one. We have 535 members of Congress with a lot of authority, and they've got to decide. But I think this is a ripe target for investigation because the families are getting turned away from the court. Because the current statement is the Saudis didn't have anything to do it, and there's plenty of evidence that they did. And they got plenty of money to pay these families and bring a little bit of justice.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've said this a number of times on this show. I lived below Canal Street on 9/11. I lived on Lafayette between Franklin and White. I remember my bed shaking from the explosion. I was woken up by the first explosion, didn't really process what it was, kind of hung out my bed and listening to sirens grow, and then eventually the second plane hit. We had a balcony. This was an NYU dorm. So I was able to see the second plane. And reading through all of this, because I've done a lot of work, because I'm doing one more episode on this too, and kind of looking into all of this, I felt sick on two occasions in the course of reading this stuff. And I don't quite have a word to describe what it feels like. I mean, sadness is the closest word I can think of, but it doesn't quite capture it. And the sadness comes from just looking back and seeing that it seems that it could have been stopped. Not could have been stopped because we now connect the dots, but the dots were connected. And that not only is that sad, but what's sad is what came out of it. And that it seems that all the people responsible not only got away with it, but got promoted. I mean, again, I don't have all the names off the top of my head because there's so many names here. But if you do the research, a lot of these folks at Alex Station were basically analysts. They weren't case officers. They had no operational experience running human sources or flipping people in the field. These people all, with the exception of maybe only the deputy station chief, got promoted. Jen Matthews was made base chief at Camp Chapman in Afghanistan, and Bukowski was promoted to run the Global Jihad Unit and was allegedly instrumental in the CIA's torture programs. Whereas people like John Kiriakou or Mark Rossini, these folks either got fired or, in John's case, actually ended up going to jail for blowing the whistle on those very same torture programs. So, like, kind of looking at it, it's anyway. That's a larger conversation to have. We'll maybe have it. I just wanted to say a few more things with respect to Congress.
If you went to the congressional record and look for floor statements in 2000, after the Cole, after East African Embassy bombing, after the attack on the World Trade Center, we knew who did it. Look for a floor statement that says we got to do more than we're already doing. Afterwards, everybody was saying we should have done more. But before, I mean, the elected people who authorized the money for Canada or any of these guys, that we did not identify it as a real and present danger.
I hear that, and that can be true. I'm not necessarily doubting it. But what I am saying is that regardless of that, it does seem that this could have been prevented. Again, not because we're connecting the dots after the fact, but because the information was available, people weren't held accountable, and also, like, to your point, Bob Graham was head of the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and he was out saying, after those 28 pages were redacted, that this information should be available to the public. He'd been banging the table for 14 years to get it out. So what is it in our understanding of how our government works that would allow a situation like this to occur where Congress is unable to alert the American people to some really serious issues, when we have the White House saying we need to take this country to war to topple Saddam, suggesting that he was somehow responsible for 9/11 and he's a big threat, when in fact it was the Saudis, and it was the Saudi ambassador literally cutting checks to the guy who was chaperoning hijackers in San Diego. So, like, how does that work exactly?
Well, how does that work?
When I say how does that work, let me be clear. What I mean is so my schema of the government is that we have three branches of government.
In some ways, 9/11 made the case that sometimes secrecy doesn't increase security, it decreases it. And I think in some ways it's kind of an underreported analysis. Does secrecy make us safer? Not necessarily. You gave several examples in this conversation where it did quite the opposite. So there are times when the most important thing is to say, let's get it declassified and out there. Let's have a conversation with the American people are the one that then decide what we're going to do. So I think a lot of the problem here had to do with, one person, I'm classified in these areas and I can't talk to you about that. And they were not talking to each other.
But doesn't Congress have the power to override what the CIA wants?
Yes, Congress has the power to declassify anything that it wants.
So then why is Bob Graham running around saying, I want these pages out there? Someone please, other than me, who I'm a senator and the head of this intelligence committee, but someone else needs to make this happen. Like, what is it? And this, by the way, this gets directly to the question of deep state. And to one of the other topics I want to bring up with you, which I have a guest coming on. I have the head of ATIP, the UAP program, coming on the show to talk about this, to understand, how is it we're having all these congressional hearings where we're learning about UAP supposedly, and there are military contractors that might have alien craft material, but somehow we're not actually getting direct answers. And somewhere there's something broken in my schema of how the government works, that the House of Congress and the Senate are unable to get basic answers to questions or get documents revealed that are pertinent to the American public.
Again, I think it's a lot of this has to do with the classification system. Myself, as an example, on the 9/11 Commission, if I went out to the NSA or go to the CIA or go to the DIA or wherever I'm going to go and I've got questions I'm trying to get answered, I have to be very precise. I can't just say I'm looking for such and such. No, I have to actually say, on the 14th of February, there was a meeting. Can you give me some information? They don't give me what I need in order to do the analysis. They give me what I've asked for, what I've specifically asked for. And it gets back to, I think we overclassify. I mean, up until, 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't even know how much in total we were spending on all the intelligence agencies. The 15, and I managed the bill, and I bring it to the floor. It had 5 pages. It's all classified. The American people didn't have a right to know. They still don't have a right to know how much we're spending on CIA, how much we're spending on NRO.
Totally. But doesn't Congress supersede the CIA? Why do they have to negotiate with departments within the executive branch?
They don't supersede them. They authorize them every year. If they don't get authorized, they have to pass an intelligence bill that authorizes CIA, DIA, all these agencies every single year.
Right. In other words, my point is they still have leverage over them. Why are they running around asking their permission to get documents released?
Because it's the way that it operates is, just take your sentence and unpack it a little bit. I have to ask specifically for a document. I can't say, You have some documents relative to Al-Qaeda that you guys were tracking.
But they had the 28 pages that were in the report that were redacted.
28 pages is a different matter. They should have just released those.
But that's what I'm saying. That's a great example. So let's just stick with that one. That's what I mean. So like they have these 28 pages, they get redacted, and Bob Graham's saying we need to release these, and he's going around saying this for 15 years before they're finally released.
Yeah.
Like why?
I don't know.
And I'm not saying what was in Bob Graham's head. I'm just saying like why? I don't get it.
I'll tell you a story. So in my first year on the committee that does oversight for Intel, and I asked for it because I had some experience with the CIA when I was in Vietnam. And so I was just interested. Anyway, I was on the committee and we're doing the budget. And by the way, committee members oftentimes don't show up for the budget. They show up for something that is public and controversial so they can get their talking point out. But we have a budget and they were building for the National Reconnaissance Office over, I think, in Arlington or somewhere over in Virginia. And I looked at the damn thing. It's like, it was way more expensive than it should have been. It was like, I don't know, $1.5 billion. And you probably got a contract and bill it for $100 million. The offices are too big. The fixtures are too expensive. Everything was over. And because it's all secret. The whole damn project was secret. And the reason we found out about it was somebody get their car filled up with gasoline close to that building, asked what it was. I didn't know what it was. A driver informed the Intelligence Committee there's a building. And so when Jim Woolsey was the director at the time, said, Jim, you got to declassify it. You can't keep this a secret. So he declassified it, and he got the shit kicked out of him from every newspaper and every news outlet. There was no reward. Nobody said that was a good thing to do. They all said it was a bad thing to do to build the building, and it wasn't his job. So oftentimes they're sitting there saying, what's going to happen?
Right.
Am I going to get called up? I mean, I'll give you another good example, George Tenet. So India detonated a nuclear weapon. 1998.
98?
Yeah. The guy who was running for prime minister of India promised that if I win this election, I'm going to detonate a nuclear weapon. And we called Tenet. He had spent 3 or 4 days with us. We kicked the shit out of him. How come he didn't know this? We did know it. It wasn't a secret. The guy was going to detonate a nuclear weapon. This didn't surprise us. If your staff is watching India news, you would have known that was likely to happen. So part of the problem is the rewards for doing the right thing oftentimes are not there. Oftentimes and you gave a couple of examples, you don't get celebrated for success. Oftentimes you get penalized for it. That really happened in Afghanistan after 9/11. And we drove the Taliban out, 3 months, 4 months? And, those guys got some decoration, but it was all classified. And so they just do it because it's the right thing to do.
How closely did you follow all the stuff during COVID related to NIH and their collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I didn't follow it. I followed it after it became controversial.
That's what I mean. So the reason I bring it up is because while I was doing a lot of the work preparing for this conversation and another one that I'm having on the 9/11 story, this relationship between CIA and Saudi intelligence had a lot of parallels to the relationship between, at least reported on, between NIH and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the common thing is the story of CIA trying to flip these guys and NIH, Wuhan trying to do gain-of-function research to get ahead of the next pandemic. And in both cases, it seems like, again, these are theories, right? These are theories. But it seems like in both cases, the effort to try and get ahead of the next thing, the next terrorist attacks, the next pandemic, actually worked to cause it. And then subsequently, no one was held accountable, and the machine started to cover up the whole thing. And anyone that spoke out against it and tried to say, hey, this seems like there's some dirt here, we should investigate it, those guys got prosecuted. Those guys got in trouble. Those guys lost their job.
Yeah, it's an excellent example of why people are reluctant to come to the public and tell people.
Well, how do we fix that? How do we fix? Because that is a broken system. I mean, if we can't have accountability, how is anyone supposed to trust anything?
It's always dependent upon people who are willing to tolerate the consequences, and oftentimes they're very negative at telling people what's going on. And, especially at NIH, they tend to be more fragile over there. They're scientists, and they oftentimes are naive. Everybody was naive about China. It was ridiculous. But I don't know that you can fix it. I think you just got to understand that it's going to happen from time to time. And I do think when it does happen and you find that you punish somebody either by attacking them, firing them, doing something bad to them because they were trying to tell us what was going on, you got to reward them. And you got to do as much as possible to take the politics out of it because this is bipartisan.
But if you reward them, it also means that you've got to hold the people that were responsible accountable.
Well, I'm not sure of that. it may be the appropriate thing to do, but at a minimum, you can't penalize the people who brought the story and told it.
I mean, the Bush team was never held accountable for what they did to this country, taking us to war on false pretenses. I mean, we're still paying the consequences of that war in Iraq. I mean, not just the trillions of dollars, but the lives lost and also the credibility for American foreign policy. I mean, all the attacks on American intentions and calling us hypocrites stem from that decision. More than anything else from that decision, it undermined the entire argument for an international liberal rules-based order. And Bush still goes on Jay Leno and says, do you miss me now because we got Trump? Well, we got Trump because of you. And I'm not just putting it all on Bush. This is, a series of stuff. But, it's really hard. Again, like I'm not a guy who's served in politics, obviously. And I think it's very important, the work that you guys do. In no way am I suggesting that it's not. And I'm with you on the cynicism part. I just think that for someone like me, and I think I'm the majority of people, right? The majority of people don't have any relationship to politics or Washington. We look at this system and we don't understand how we're expected to buy into it and buy into arguments about democracy is on the line. Or like, the Capitol building gets attacked and Joe Biden goes out on the podium and he talks about this is the greatest attack against our democracy. I'm like, are you joking? Like you're saying this is a bigger attack on our democracy than when the executive branch got everyone to buy into this argument about taking us to war on false pretenses? This is a bigger deal than some guys like getting into the Capitol wearing like cowboy hats. And I just think it's one of those things where the system has gotten so used to this. And the part of it is something you identified, which is that the media, the centralized media system has broken. Right. So it's very difficult to control the narrative like they used to be able to do. So I think without accountability and transparency, it just gets very hard to run this government because there are lots of people out there coming up with conspiracies, most of them crazy, wild conspiracies, because there's a vacuum of truth. Yeah. Well, look, I think that it's to overstate that there's no question that effort to stop the counting electoral votes was a terrible moment. And it was, I watched it and I was horrified by it. But it's not, I don't think that all those guys are going to jail. The guy that urged on them is not going to jail. I don't know what all the numbers look like. I favor pardoning some of those guys. Jesus, they got carried away and they did something dumb. But, order was restored and the electoral college votes were counted and the president lost and he refused to accept it. And I think he has thrown gas on this fire. But the question that you're asking, is that the greatest threat to democracy ever? And it's not even close. The greatest threat to our union happened from 1861 to 65. It's been worse than it is today. I think the greatest threat may be people just giving up on the whole damn thing. Yeah, no, I know a lot of people that feel like that. And I'm dismayed by the popularity of Donald Trump. And this goes back to my point about, leadership and the lack of leadership. And I feel like it's very difficult for people from the establishment to vie for that leadership because so much of the trust is broken. And so you get outsiders. And in this case, I'm not I don't need to keep saying it. People can have their own political opinions. I'm not here to pass judgment. I've never been compelled by the things that Donald Trump has to say. And I long for leadership in this country. And I think that we need a new way forward. And I just don't see it. But anyway, I'm not cynical. And I agree with you on that. And I try not to be. And cynicism does not come natural for me. But we've got a ways to go still. You're familiar with, we got to better sleep under a rock not to know about Project 2025. I think Trump's lying when he said I don't know anything about it. But what would give me hope. But that's the Heritage Foundation, right? Yeah, but he knows the people that wrote that report. He met with him, he talked to him. He knows what 2025 is all about. That's the Heritage report. My guess is, and I've read it, and there's a couple of things that I would say. If I was still in the Senate, I would say, I think I can support this. It's entirely possible that there's some good in that report, and we demonize it. And they're going to have an authoritarian government because they're going to fire a whole bunch of people and take power and control. Well, there's a case to have more. Well, they clearly need to fire people for sure. I mean, as we've just discussed, there needs to be firing. Yeah. But the question is, who's going to be doing the firing, and what is the rationale and the thinking behind that? I don't like the rationale behind it. If you came to me and said, the government's too big, there's too much secrecy, we're going to take it down, especially in the national security, intel space, we're going to take it down by, 20%. I wouldn't say no right off the bat. It's gotten too big. In a classified environment, it's hard to manage all these damn things because I can't really tell the American people what's going on. And at the end of the day, it's not an exaggeration to say the most important people when it comes to oversight are the American people. And if I withhold, I don't know what they spend close to $100 billion a year on all this stuff now.
If I withhold $100 billion of the spending and say, Demetri, you don't have a right to know how that money is being spent, I lose all that oversight. I just do. And you don't have to look very far to find examples where Congress gets alerted. My favorite is, I don't know what it was, a couple of years ago, there was an incident where somebody in the military was discharged to the VA. He was actually at Walter Reed, discharged the VA into a facility right across the street. His family came to see him again, and they didn't know where he was. They lost him because the computers didn't talk to each other. It looks like the same healthcare system, but there's no communication back and forth. They tried to fix it, and I think they've improved it, but that's a good example where Congress didn't pay attention to it. The Veterans Committee didn't say, oh, we better button this thing up. They didn't. Not until somebody complained about it, in this case, a family. It got in the press. It became a big story. And then Congress did something about it. That $100 billion of intel spending, there's almost no chance for the people to get a good sense where it's being spent right, where it's being spent wrong. I don't have a right to know.
So, Senator Kerrey, I got one or maybe a couple more questions about the Saudi connection, just to tie this one off, just to hear kind of what your thoughts are. We didn't talk about Prince Turki Al-Faisal. He was the director of Saudi intelligence ahead of 9/11. He actually resigned on September 1st in 2001. Do you think there was any significance to that resignation? And did you guys learn anything about him when you were looking into this?
We didn't learn much at all about him other than he had resigned. We knew that fact. But this is on behalf of the families, but also on behalf of trying to improve the quality of our security. This whole thing needs to be investigated by Congress. We have a 9/11 commission. It's 535 people that are authorized in the Congress to authorize and appropriate the money for our intelligence. And they had a right to do this. And there's no shortage of people that are critical of Saudi Arabia today, so that shouldn't be hard to do, other than they have a lot of money. So I think Congress just needs, when they pick something up like this, they're suspicious about it. And there's plenty in this Bayoumi case that's suspicious. Investigate it. Issue subpoenas. Bring people up. Find out what happened. Same thing with Iran, by the way. We don't know that the government was involved, but these guys were flying through Tehran. They're Sunni. They're not exactly going to get the red carpet rolled out for them when they land in Tehran. There's lots of things like that need to be investigated, not based upon a conspiracy, but based upon real hard evidence that something happened that arises to Congress putting together a special committee to investigate it.
I mentioned the UAP thing. Do you have any thoughts on that? During your time in the Senate, did you hear anything, any stories from people? Harry Reid was obviously someone that spearheaded this. I think he was the one that authorized the creation of ATIP, the program that Lou Elizondo headed up to investigate this story. But I'm curious, what do you know about this?
Almost nothing. I know Harry cared about it. I get asked about it when I'm in. I get asked a lot about it afterwards. But my knowledge base there is I can pretend. I could talk for an hour as if I knew what the fuck I was talking about.
I don't want you to do that, and I hate when people do that. So I'll ask it another way, and feel free to answer it however you want, or not answer it if you feel like you can't. What would be the important questions to be asking yourself, or what's your sort of impression of what you've heard? Forget what you know for sure or don't know. What's your impression of all this? Just looking at it from the outside, how the government works. Why are we not getting answers? What is your impression of what's going on here?
If I was still in the Senate, I'd say, okay, you got 1,000 points of contact, whatever the contact is. So if you're 100% certain that that's a military contact and it needs to be classified, keep it classified. But if you're not, declassified. Get it out to the public. Because this, no matter what you do, you're going to have conspiracies around this about unidentified flying objects. I think I just saw one. So it's.
Have you ever seen one?
No. Have you?
I don't think I have. No, I don't think I have. And this has been a crazy experience for me because I've told people this, friends of mine, that this is the weirdest experience for me because I'm pretty good at using a set of heuristics I've developed over time to get in the right direction of travel on a story. This is one where I'm kind of all over the place because on the one hand, whenever I hear people making big claims and then not offering specifics, I'm like, well, that's a big red flag. Or you're telling me about, how credible all these people are that you spoke to. What are you showing me? You're talking to me about an implant? Where's the DNA of the implant? Show me the alien DNA. You're talking about biologics. But at the same time, I also don't have a framework in my head to understand how so many people in positions of power, we talk about Harry Reid, all these folks can be talking about there's something going on and that there not be something going on. So there's so much smoke that I can't quite, and of course we've seen these videos. I don't know if you've seen these videos, but what do you think of these videos, right? Those videos by the USS Nimitz where these objects moving in crazy distances and caught on different instruments. This is not just, visual, it's also radar and some other.
Look, and this is embedded deep. I know enough about it to know that there's some serious things going on, but it's embedded deep. You got 330 million Americans, say you got 250 over the age of 15. How many of them know about this? A lot. So there's great rewards, in my view, to aggressively declassify that information. There just is. Let the people themselves examine the data. Let's have a debate about it. Let's look at it. Let's have a broader conversation about what's going on. I don't know.
Do you think we will?
No, I don't think it will. Again, they're afraid. They're worried about the negative consequences of releasing that information. And so a part of what the public has to do is be prepared to protect them if there's negative consequence for doing the right thing. That's always a worry for me when it comes to the public sector, because the punishment can run hot.
Man, it's scary. I'll tell you what, I wouldn't go up against the government. I'm very impressed by some of the people that have. And again, you run into some of these folks when you're researching a story like this, and it's awful. I was reading about one guy, I can't remember what he did, what he blew the whistle on, but apparently he's just lived the rest of his life in solitary confinement.
I'm not surprised. Look, at a lower level, our prosecutors have way too much power. Way too much. And the problem is there's prosecutors inside the housing agency, the Housing and Urban Development, whatever the name is now. I don't know what, I'll just guess. There's 20 federal agencies with the authority to use a firearm to get you to do what they want you to do. All these agencies that have lethal authority, if you don't do what they want to do, they need to be looked at.
And they'll raid your house. I mean, people get raided.
And when Clinton was being investigated by special prosecutor, my point was that Clinton, you should take this on, not for your defense, but say, imagine if you weren't president of the United States, if you didn't have the resources to defend yourself, if you didn't have, all these guys that are being investigated. I got no love for the Trump family just on instinct.
No, they've gone after him and all the people around him. I mean, there's a lot of political prosecutions going on, and it muddies the water because it makes it difficult to.
I'm sure there's many of them that have had to declare bankruptcy because they just couldn't afford the lawyers, legal counsel necessary to defend themselves. Because once they say issue the subpoena, they come right behind that with discovery. I want everything that you've got for the last 20 years that has the word "the" in it. And the next thing you know, the discovery process just gets more and more expensive. So I personally think across the board, then I'd take a really close look to reduce the power of these prosecutors. It's not just a sheriff, for God's sakes. It's getting the bad guys and getting the wrong bad guys. It's going to be devastating for somebody and these lower level staff people in the federal government. I can't take their side because I'm a Democrat and they're going after Trump. And no, go after them. Likewise with Clinton. And we missed an opportunity. I think the prosecutors have way too much power. And it just goes dark. Once the first headline's out, they're investigating Demetri, and you see a little story about it. It doesn't end. It sure as hell doesn't end for you.
No, it's super scary. I mean, you could feel the weight of the federal government on top of people in these situations.
Yeah.
Senator Kerrey, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. It was great to see you again. I hope that we'll have a chance to meet up in person sometime again soon.
Demetri, I've learned a lot from you. In case you're sometimes wondering whether or not you've accumulated information that's not useful, it was useful to me to listen to some things that I don't know that I feel like I needed to know.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. It was great having you on.
I'll see you again.
If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.